This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video will be looking at a particular topic resonating with the season of Christmas right upon us, which is the birth narrative in the Gospel of Luke, what we read every year for Christmas. But in fact, if you look at Luke chapters 1 and 2, there's not one birth narrative, there's two. So this is about the two birth narratives, or the one narrative of two births. This is different than you can look back at a previous Theology Bits video that compared the birth narrative in Luke compared to the birth narrative in Matthew. They are different, there's different emphases, but this is something else. This is looking just at the Gospel of Luke itself, and you have the birth of two figures. Of course, it's a story of the birth of Jesus. But it's not only the story of the birth of Jesus, there's also the birth of John, later to be called John the Baptist. And so what I'd like to invite us into looking at is, what are these two narratives and how do they dialogue with one another? Because in fact, they're not two separate narratives, but they're interspersed. A little bit of the John narrative, then a little bit of the Jesus narrative, a little back to John, a little bit back to Jesus, a little bit. They are made directly to be relating to one another. So let's just see what they're up to. So most of you know the birth narrative and the players of who is involved in the birth of Jesus. Well, there's Mary and Joseph, though in Luke's gospel, you put Joseph in parentheses. Joseph doesn't have a speaking part here. Joseph doesn't really do very much in this narrative. Here on the John side, you have Zechariah. Zechariah does a lot, and Elizabeth as the parents. And maybe we'll go through this side and then we'll go back to the other. Of Elizabeth and Zechariah are described as they have become older and they believe they are barren, having no children. Zechariah is a priest, and it says, in addition to that, Elizabeth is also from a priestly family, and that the angel Gabriel visits and tells them, your prayer has been answered. But in fact, it's important also where the angel visits, which is Zechariah is a priest, and he said he's been chosen by lot to enter into the sanctuary next to the altar. Well, that suggests that this is happening in Jerusalem, and that Zechariah is in the temple. And so in the temple, an angel appears. Those of you who know your Hebrew Bible know that actually has happened before, most notably in the call of Isaiah. And what he says to Zechariah is, your wife will bear a child, and the child, the Holy Spirit, will come upon this child, and that this child is going to do amazing things. And Zechariah's response, how can this be? Because we are older, my wife is barren. And because of that, he says, Zechariah is made mute for his lack of faith, but that after this, the child then is born. Elizabeth goes and visits Mary while she's still pregnant. We have the whole Mary story in a moment. And then Zechariah can speak, and he declares a prophecy. He starts prophesying, and you have what's sometimes called the Benedictus, or the Song of Zechariah. And then we discover other people learn about who this is, specifically when John is named. There's a whole drama where remember, Zechariah can't speak. It says that his name is going to be John. The angel had said his name was going to be John. And there's this whole drama where everyone says, "You sure? I don't think that's correct." And he writes out, "Yes, it's to be John." And then is able to speak and has this big speech that other people hear and experience, and then they wonder what this is going to be and contemplate in their hearts. Now on this side, we have some parallels, that we have some differences. So first, Mary is there, but instead of it being in Jerusalem, it is deliberately said to be in the Galilee. In the Galilee, up in the north, nowhere near Jerusalem. And that not barren, not old, but Mary's a virgin. And so an angel visits. And I should say the point here of here, they're a priest. Here, the emphasis of Mary and Joseph, specifically Joseph, is a descendant of David. Real emphasis on that. And an angel appears, and it's the angel Gabriel again, and says that you're going to bear a child. And then Mary responds, "Oh," just like Zechariah had. However, that question doesn't lead to her being mute for unbelief, but instead the angel Gabriel saying nothing is impossible for God. And Mary responding, "Let it be with me according to your word." And so we have then a movement, and part of nothing is impossible is the evidence that the angel gives is Elizabeth being pregnant is the evidence that nothing's impossible. So let it be with me according to your word. And then Mary, just like Zechariah had the Benedictus, Mary sings the Magnificat. And the emphasis in the Magnificat is for the poor, the lowly, the marginalized. Comparatively, the Benedictus, we didn't talk about its content, the Benedictus is about Jewish Messiah. Going to save Israel from Israel's enemies, that there is going to be finally the throne of your ancestor David will be finally recognized according to the oath that God made in God's covenant with Abraham. Abraham does come up over here, but only once. And then you have the whole story about the birth in the stable, and which is an interesting narrative that includes some details and excludes a lot of details that people think are there. But for that, I'd invite you to look at that video from last year. And then we get to the naming ceremony of Jesus. There's not a big drama about who the name is like there was in John, but there is when we have this naming, and then we go into the temple and offer the offerings for the firstborn son, which has to do with a requirement from the book of Exodus after the Passover, that you meet Simeon and Anna, who both proclaim things about this baby. And again, that here, now other people start to get to know. You have the shepherds as well, but especially there at the naming, with other people getting to know. So you see some parallels here, but also some differences. So the first thing that becomes very clear is that here on this side, we're in Jerusalem to establish the Jewish Messiah. Very clearly, that's going to be the emphasis. Going to be the Messiah. Save Israel. The throne will be reestablished. The Holy Spirit is going to be the agent through which that happens. And that this is going to prepare the way, because after all, this is about the birth of John. And then here on this side, we have a lot less, especially in the Magnificat, about the Jewish Messiah, and more about the way that this child is going to change the structure of the world itself. And these two things are in tension with one another, meaning that there were people expecting a Jewish Messiah to establish Israel in the way that one imagined, but didn't necessarily think that came with just changing the whole of the world. By contrast, there were a lot of people, not necessarily Jewish, but who were calling out for God to finally change this world, finally break the bonds that it was under. But what it didn't have necessarily was that the Jewish Messiah had anything to do with it. This was a much larger thing. Here, in these two narratives, it ties them together. This great reversal for the poor, the lowly, the marginalized turns out to be exactly what this person who's going to do on the throne of David is going to be all about. And then we have that it's so thereby, who is the people of God? Well, as emphasized here, absolutely includes the people who have always been the people of God, the descendants of Abraham. But also here, who are going to be the people of God are going to be those who are not necessarily Jewish, but who are overlooked, that God stands with the marginalized. And then you have this focus of the Galilee versus the Jerusalem, that a lot of the things we expected could happen in Jerusalem and the temple turn out to be able to happen up in the hinterlands where people actually live. There's a much more global sense of this if you have them both, because that doesn't eliminate what is in Jerusalem, but adds to it what's in the Galilee. And then we have here this, which that not only the place, but also simply, what is the temple? What is the household? Where does God dwell? Where does the angel show up? Both places. That is, there is a place for a dedicated worship space. There's also a place for your home that turns out also to be a worship space that maybe you weren't taking into account. That there is stability in the tradition. It means something to be the people of God, built on a tradition going back, in this case for them, over 2,000 years, compared to there is also God doing a new thing for a new people. And both things are always going to be there at both times. So you see these two birth narratives are here, not just to give you interesting information about John and Jesus, but to be able to say, God is doing something new, and that new thing is exactly what God had been intending this whole time, even if you didn't know. That it turns out that everything we were expecting included a lot of surprises. And surprise might be the biggest focus here when you introduce the Holy Spirit. I didn't put it over here, but Holy Spirit is going to come upon Mary, and that's how she's going to give birth. The Holy Spirit shows up now not just on the child, but on Zechariah when he speaks, on Elizabeth when she greets Mary. The Holy Spirit is active and working throughout this to lead to a lot of surprise. That the God we've always known is doing something new, but remains the God we've always known. And so this narrative really ties a lot of major themes together to say, many things are true. God is with us. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.